Have you ever noticed how you can be surrounded by people, at a party, in a meeting, even sitting at dinner with friends, and still feel completely, profoundly alone? Not just alone in the sense of being by yourself, but alone in a way that feels like you're watching life happen through a window you can't open. There's something strange about this kind of loneliness. It doesn't make sense on the surface. You're not isolated. You're not locked away in some empty room. You're literally standing in a crowd, shoulder to shoulder with other human beings, and yet the distance between you and them feels infinite. Most people think loneliness is about being physically separated from others, but what if the deepest kind of loneliness has nothing to do with how many people are in the room? What psychological forces could make someone feel invisible while standing right in front of you? Here's the truth. Loneliness in a crowd isn't a contradiction. It's actually one of the most common forms of isolation in our modern world, and the psychology behind it reveals something profound about what we really need as human beings. Because you can have 100 people around you and still be starving for connection. You can talk to dozens of people in a day and never say anything that matters. You can be seen by everyone and understood by no one. And that gap between being around people and feeling connected to them is where this particular kind of loneliness lives. But here's what's fascinating. The people who experience this most intensely aren't antisocial or broken or fundamentally different from anyone else. They're often highly perceptive, deeply feeling individuals who understand connection so well that anything less than authentic intimacy feels like wearing a mask that's slowly suffocating them. And the psychology behind why they feel this way runs deeper than most people realize. Let's start with what's actually happening in your brain when you're lonely in a crowd. Your brain is wired for connection through something called mirror neurons. These remarkable cells that fire both when you do something and when you watch someone else do it. They're the reason you flinch when you see someone get hurt. They're the neural foundation of empathy, of understanding, of that electric moment when someone truly gets you. But here's the thing. Mirror neurons don't just need proximity to activate meaningfully. They need something psychologists call attunement, that subtle dance where two people actually perceive and respond to each other's inner worlds. Without attunement, you can be in a room with 1,000 people and your brain might as well be alone on a desert island. Think about it. You're at a social gathering and you're going through all the motions. You're smiling, nodding, asking the right questions, laughing at the appropriate moments. But underneath it all, there's this gnawing sense that you're performing rather than connecting. That you're showing people a version of yourself that's acceptable, presentable, safe, but not real. Not you. And here's what's really happening. Your brain can tell the difference. Your nervous system knows when connection is authentic and when it's just social choreography. And when you spend hours, days, years engaging with people on a surface level while your deeper self remains hidden and untouched, your brain registers that as isolation, as loneliness, even in a crowd. This is where attachment theory becomes important. The psychologist John Bowlby discovered that humans don't just need physical proximity to others. We need what he called a secure base, someone who sees us, understands us, and responds to our emotional needs. Without that secure base, we can be surrounded by people and still feel fundamentally alone. And this is where it gets complex. Some people develop what's called an insecure attachment style early in life, often because their caregivers were physically present but emotionally distant. They learned that people can be right there and still not really be there. That you can be in someone's presence and still be invisible. So as adults, even when they're in a crowd, part of them is braced for that same emotional absence. They're expecting the disconnection. And sometimes they unconsciously create it. But the truth is, you don't need a specific attachment style to feel lonely in a crowd. Sometimes it's simpler and more universal than that. Sometimes it's just the weight of living in a world that values breadth over depth. Think about how many interactions you have in a given week that are transactional, superficial, or performative. How many conversations are just exchanging information rather than sharing something real? How many times you say, "I'm fine," when you're not because the person asking doesn't really want to know, and you don't have the energy to explain the truth to someone who isn't genuinely curious. And maybe that's the real heart of crowd loneliness. It's not about being around people. It's about being around people who don't know you, who can't see past the surface you present, who interact with your mask instead of your face. You become a collection of roles, employee, friend, family member, acquaintance, but somewhere in all those roles, the actual you gets lost. And the loneliest feeling in the world is being surrounded by people who know your name but not your story, who see your smile but not your struggle, who think they know you because they recognize you, but they've never actually met the person who lives behind your eyes. Here's what researchers have found. The quality of your social connections matters infinitely more than the quantity. A study published in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships found that people with fewer but deeper friendships reported significantly lower levels of loneliness than those with many superficial connections. Another study on social isolation found that perceived loneliness, the feeling of being alone regardless of how many people are around, is actually a stronger predictor of depression and anxiety than objective social isolation. In other words, your brain doesn't care how many people you're around. It cares whether you feel truly connected to them. And this is where the psychology gets really interesting. When you feel lonely in a crowd, you often start to believe there's something wrong with you. You look around and see other people laughing, connecting, seemingly having no trouble at all, and you think, why can't I do that? Why do I feel so different? Why does this feel so hard for me when it seems easy for everyone else? But here's the thing, you're not seeing the whole picture. You're seeing people's exteriors, their social performances, the faces they show the world. You have no idea what they're feeling inside. Research on social comparison shows that we consistently overestimate other people's happiness and underestimate their struggles because we compare our insides to their outsides. That person who seems so comfortable, so connected, so naturally social, they might be going home and feeling exactly what you feel. They might be just as skilled at hiding it. The psychology behind this runs deeper into something called the spotlight effect. You assume people are noticing your discomfort, your awkwardness, your inability to connect. But cognitive research shows that people are far less focused on you than you think they are. Most people are so caught up in managing their own social anxieties and insecurities that they barely notice yours. So you're standing there feeling exposed and visible in your loneliness, but the irony is that your loneliness itself makes you invisible. People can't see what you're not showing them. They can't connect with what you're hiding. And so the very thing you're trying to protect, your real self, becomes the thing that could actually bridge the gap between you and genuine connection. But here's what's really happening beneath all of this. When you feel lonely in a crowd, part of you is grieving. You're grieving the connection you need but don't have. You're grieving the understanding you crave but haven't found. You're grieving the version of social interaction where you don't have to pretend, where you can show up as you are and be met with curiosity instead of judgment. And grief, even this subtle kind, is exhausting. It's why you can leave a party feeling more drained than before you arrived. You spent the whole time maintaining a performance, managing the gap between who you are and who you're pretending to be, and carrying the quiet sadness of not being truly seen. And this is where the long-term consequences start to compound. When you consistently feel lonely in social situations, you start to withdraw, not from people necessarily, but from authenticity. You get better and better at the performance. You learn which version of yourself people respond to, which stories get laughs, which expressions make you seem approachable and normal. You become skilled at social camouflage. But the better you get at fitting in, the lonelier you feel because now you're not even giving people the chance to know the real you. You're protecting yourself from rejection by never offering anything real enough to reject. It's a devastating kind of safety. You're safe from being hurt, but you're also safe from being known. And humans aren't meant to live that way. Psychologist Carl Rogers talked about something he called conditions of worth. The idea that we learn early on that love and acceptance are conditional on behaving in certain ways. So we shape ourselves to meet those conditions. We hide the parts that might not be acceptable. We perform the version of ourselves that we think will be loved. And in doing so, we create what Rogers called incongruence, a gap between our real self and the self we present to the world. That gap is where loneliness lives. Not in empty rooms, but in crowded ones where you're present in body but absent in spirit. But the truth is, this pattern didn't start with you being broken or difficult or fundamentally unlovable. It started with a very human need for safety. At some point, maybe in childhood, maybe later, you learned that being fully yourself wasn't safe. That certain parts of you were too much or not enough. That vulnerability led to hurt. So you adapted. You built walls. You learned to show people edited versions of yourself. And for a while, maybe it worked. Maybe it kept you safe from rejection, from judgment, from the pain of being misunderstood. But here's what happens over time. Those walls that were meant to protect you from others start to trap you away from yourself. You spend so much time managing how you appear that you lose touch with how you actually are. You become lonely even from yourself. And maybe that's the real tragedy of crowd loneliness. It's not just about feeling disconnected from the people around you. It's about feeling disconnected from yourself. When you're constantly performing, constantly adjusting, constantly hiding parts of who you are, you lose access to your own authenticity. You forget what it feels like to just be, without editing or filtering or managing. You forget that connection isn't about being perfect or acceptable or easy to understand. It's about being real, messy, complex, human, and letting someone else see that and choose to stay anyway. But here's what's fascinating about all of this. The very thing that makes you feel lonely in crowds, your sensitivity, your depth, your awareness that most interactions are surface level, is actually a strength, not a weakness. You're not broken for wanting real connection. You're not too much for craving depth. You're not difficult for being unable to settle for shallow conversations that go nowhere. You're actually in touch with a fundamental human need that our modern world has become remarkably good at ignoring. Research on meaningful relationships shows that people who prioritize quality over quantity in their social lives report higher levels of well-being, life satisfaction, and emotional health. Your instinct toward depth isn't a flaw. It's wisdom. The question isn't why you feel lonely in crowds. The question is what you're going to do with that loneliness, because you have choices here. You can keep performing, keep hiding, keep maintaining the walls that protect you from vulnerability and also from connection. Or you can start taking small risks. You can start showing up a little more honestly. You can practice saying something real even when it's uncomfortable. You can look for the other people in the crowd who also seem like they're watching from a distance, who also seem like they're hungry for something deeper, and you can take the terrifying step of letting them see you. Not the edited version, not the performance, but you. Here's what research on vulnerability tells us. The fear of being truly seen is almost always worse than the reality. When Brené Brown studied shame and connection, she found that the people who felt the most connected in their lives were the ones who had the courage to be imperfect, to show up authentically even when there were no guarantees of acceptance. They didn't wait to feel safe before being vulnerable. They understood that vulnerability is what creates safety. That real connection can't happen until someone takes the risk of being real first. And yes, sometimes you'll reach out and be met with misunderstanding. Sometimes you'll show someone your real self and they won't know what to do with it. Sometimes you'll be vulnerable and it won't be reciprocated. But here's the thing, that's not failure. That's information. It tells you who has the capacity to meet you where you are. It helps you find your people instead of wasting years trying to force connection with people who can't give you what you need. And in the process of being authentic, even when it's met with silence, you start to reclaim something precious. Your relationship with yourself. You start to remember what it feels like to be known, even if only by you. To stop abandoning yourself in pursuit of connection with others. Because here's the truth that no one talks about. You can't feel truly connected to others if you're disconnected from yourself. If you're hiding who you are, performing who you think you should be, you're essentially asking people to love a version of you that doesn't exist. And even when they do, even when your performance is convincing enough that people like the mask you're wearing, it doesn't touch the loneliness. Because you know they don't really know you. You know the connection is fragile because it's built on pretense. You know that if they saw the real you, the messy, uncertain, beautifully complex real you, they might leave. So even their presence can't quiet the loneliness. But what if you started showing up differently? Not all at once. Not in some grand gesture of complete vulnerability with everyone you meet, but in small, intentional ways. What if, the next time someone asks how you are, you tell them something true instead of defaulting to fine? What if you share something you're actually struggling with instead of just your accomplishments? What if you stop trying to be impressive and start trying to be honest? What if you look for depth instead of breadth, and invest your energy in a few relationships where real connection seems possible instead of spreading yourself thin across dozens of shallow ones? The psychology of crowd loneliness teaches us something profound. We're all walking around hungry for the same thing. For understanding. For being seen. For matching to someone in a way that's specific and irreplaceable. Every person in that crowd, even the ones who seem so confident and connected, is carrying their own invisible loneliness. Their own hunger for something real. Their own fear that if they show too much, they'll be rejected. We're all performing versions of ourselves we think will be acceptable, and then wondering why we feel so alone. It's a collective tragedy. But it's also an opportunity. Because the moment you decide to risk being real, you give others permission to do the same. The moment you stop pretending everything is perfect, you create space for someone else to admit that they're struggling too. The moment you show up with your actual complexity instead of a simplified, palatable version of yourself, you invite deeper connection. Not with everyone, but with someone. And sometimes just one person who really sees you can heal years of crowd loneliness. So if you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people, if you've ever smiled through a party while your heart ached with loneliness, If you've ever wondered what's wrong with you that you can't just relax and connect the way everyone else seems to, nothing is wrong with you. You're not too sensitive. You're not too complicated. You're not broken or damaged or fundamentally alone. You're a human being with a deep need for authentic connection in a world that often settles for performance. And the fact that you can't settle for that, the fact that shallow connection leaves you feeling empty, isn't a weakness. It's a compass pointing you toward what you actually need. The loneliness you feel in crowds isn't the end of your story. It's an invitation. An invitation to stop abandoning yourself for the sake of fitting in. An invitation to find your people instead of trying to be everyone's person. An invitation to remember that connection isn't about being perfect or easy or uncomplicated. It's about being brave enough to be real, even when real is messy and uncertain and sometimes met with silence. Because somewhere out there, someone else is standing in a crowd feeling exactly what you feel. And the moment you're brave enough to show up as you are, you might just find each other. And that is worth the risk.